This story follows a mother named Emily Carter who woke in the middle of the night to her daughter's voice coming from the basement. She believed Lily had gone downstairs alone, the house quiet and the furnace clicking in the cold. But when she checked Lily's bedroom, her daughter was still asleep in bed. The voice continued anyway, calling for help from beneath the floor. By the time Emily reached the basement door, the voice was using her name. Some voices do not belong to the people they sound like, and some doors should never be opened. Today's story takes place in January 2026, in a small town on the edge of the Montana wilderness, where snow fell thick and silent, blanketing the roads and forests in white. Emily Carter had lived at the edge of the forest for more than a decade, raising her daughter Lily with her husband Mark after the death of her parents. The Carters' house was old, its wood darkened by time, with a basement that creaked and groaned in ways that sounded almost alive during the long winter nights. Emily had grown used to the small noises, the settling of the floorboards, the occasional drip from pipes, the furnace clicking in uneven rhythms. But the night Lily's voice called to her from below, she had learned there were sounds no one could explain. The day had started like any other winter day. Mark shoveled the driveway before the snowplow could reach their property, brushing thick powder off the car roofs and windows, while Lily tugged at his coat, asking questions about the forest. "Do you think anyone's living in the trees, Daddy?" she asked. Mark laughed lightly, brushing her hair back. "No one, Pumpkin, just the trees and the snow." He didn't know why, but he felt a weight in his chest, a small unease he couldn't explain. Emily watched them from the kitchen window, hands wrapped around her mug of coffee, noting the way shadows lingered at the edges of the trees, longer than they should, darker than the snow around them. She shook it off as imagination, telling herself the forest always looked stranger at dawn. By late morning, Daniel Reyes, a night route delivery driver for the area, had started his first rounds. He had been driving these roads for years and knew every bend, every tree line, every stretch of empty highway. Normally, he saw nothing but snow, frost, and the occasional deer. But lately, he had begun noticing odd patterns. Shadows that moved counter to the wind, tracks that appeared overnight in impossible shapes, lights flickering in abandoned cabins. His truck's heater hummed, keeping him alert, though the cold crept through his sleeves as he parked at the Carter house. Emily opened the door to accept a small package, marking the day on her calendar, nodding politely to Daniel without thinking much about it. Mark waved from the driveway, brushing snow from his boots. Daniel had seen families like the Carters before. Neat, quiet, seemingly normal, and he liked them enough to smile, though he felt an edge of tension on roads like this. After the delivery, he drove along the forest road, noticing the bends and pines, aware that after dark no one dared travel this path. Local elders had warned him. "If you hear your name called after dark," one said quietly in the diner. "No, you didn't." Another, a native elder from the reservation near the mountains, leaned close and whispered, "It doesn't wear faces, it wears relationships." Daniel remembered that morning as he drove, keeping his eyes on the dark tree line, feeling as if unseen eyes were observing him from every shadow. Inside the Carter house, life seemed deceptively ordinary. Lily built small snow forts in the yard, at the tiny snowballs she tossed at her father, oblivious to the tension in the air. Emily prepared lunch, the aroma of simmering stew filling the warm kitchen, while Mark mended a loose floorboard near the stairs. But as the day waned and the light shifted into the pale blue-gray of late afternoon, Emily felt the subtle changes she had noticed before. A floorboard creaked slightly when no one walked above it. A shadow stretched longer than the sun should allow. and the basement door sat darker than the rest of the house. Lily wandered near the door, pretending not to notice the strange chill, and Mark was busy hammering to himself. Emily tried to push down the sense of foreboding, focusing on small domestic details, the stove, the dishes, the way Lily tied her mittens. Yet she remembered the night that had begun it all, the night she had heard Lily calling from the basement, her voice using Emily's name in a way that was impossible. She could feel that tension building again, the kind that made the hair rise on her arms. Outside, the wind bent the trees over the driveway, the snow drifting in slow spirals, and Daniel's truck passed the end of their driveway on his next route. He slowed, noticing the house, noting the way the shadows pressed against the windows and the faint scrape of something against the basement door. He had become alert to small details, things no one else seemed to see. Mark stepped into the kitchen, wiping his hands, noticing Emily staring at the basement door as if she expected something to appear. He asked her lightly, "Are you still thinking about that voice?" She nodded subtly, refusing to elaborate. Mark felt the edge of unease too, though he tried to reassure himself with rational explanations. A draft, the house settling, an overactive imagination. But he could not shake the certainty that something was not right. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked, breaking the rhythm of the snowstorm, and Daniel's headlights disappeared around the bend. The silence returned heavier than before. That evening, the Carters ate quietly, small sounds amplified in the empty house. The clink of cutlery, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the way Lily's breathing changed when she leaned over her plate. Emily noticed the shadows moving along the walls, shifting subtly when she wasn't looking directly at them. She told herself it was fatigue, but the feeling in her chest grew, a tightness that matched the weight of the forest outside. Daniel, meanwhile, had parked his truck near the edge of a clearing in the forest to check a map. The snow muffled his footsteps, yet he felt the strange impression of being followed, of something observing him from the darkness. He shook it off, attributing it to nerves, but remembered the elder's words. The night settled over the Carters' home, heavy and silent, yet alive with small, almost imperceptible movements. The settling of the house, the whisper of the wind through the pines, the faint tap of snow sliding down the roof. Emily checked the basement door again, hand hovering over the handle. Lily played nearby, unaware. Mark, oblivious to the tension he felt. And somewhere beneath the floor, a voice waited. Patient, familiar, wrong. Some things did not belong to the people they sounded like, and some doors, once opened, could never be closed. In January, the nights came early, swallowing the snow-covered town in cold shadows long before dinner. The wind swept across the snow-covered fields, rattling the windows and carrying the faint, hollow whistle of the trees, as though the forest itself were breathing. Emily was in the living room, reading while Mark sorted bills at the kitchen table, the small lamplight casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Lily had been tucked into bed, asleep under a thick quilt, her small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. At first, the house seemed ordinary. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the occasional pop of the furnace, the faint creak of the floorboards as the old house settled. Then came a sound, soft at first, almost imperceptible over the hum of the appliances. It was Daniel's truck, making its nightly rounds on the frozen roads. He slowed as he drove past the Carters' driveway, noticing something strange in the tree line. At first, it looked like a person, standing perfectly still on a snowbank just beyond the forest's edge, face turned toward the road. Then he realized the figure's features were wrong. The proportions didn't make sense. The eyes seemed slightly too far apart, the jawline too rigid. He blinked and looked again. It had not moved. He pressed the accelerator gently, but even as his tires crunched through fresh snow, the figure remained, unmoving, observing. Emily, upstairs, heard something she couldn't immediately place. A faint scratching, like claws against the concrete of the basement, followed by a whisper that made her freeze. "Mom," it called softly, deliberately, impossibly familiar. Her heart hammered, but she forced herself to remember Lily was asleep. She ignored it, clutching her notebook to her chest, yet the feeling of being watched settled deep in her bones. Meanwhile, Daniel's radio flickered. A soft static buzzed in his ears, then words emerged, careful and precise. "Daniel." He looked down at the dashboard. His name, clear, whispered through the speakers, though no one else was in the cab. Goosebumps spread across his arms. He scanned the roadside, eyes wide, but the snow reflected only white light, the trees standing like silent sentinels. Further down the road, a rancher had let his dog out briefly, the small animal bounding through deep snow before it froze mid-step, ears pricked. A growl rose from the throat of the dog, low and urgent, aimed at nothing visible. The dog charged forward, teeth bared, lunge after lunge at an invisible target. Then, in a sudden twist of panic, the animal screamed, stumbling backward, eyes wide, fur bristling. "Ah!" The rancher ran out, calling for it, only to find the dog trembling violently, staring past him as if the forest itself had reached inside. At the Carter home, Emily had gone to check the basement again. Her hand trembled as it hovered over the cold metal handle. Mark appeared behind her, frowning, brushing the hair from his forehead. "What is it?" he asked quietly. I think I heard Lily," Emily whispered, voice tight, though Lily was upstairs. "From the basement?" Mark's brow furrowed. "That's impossible. She's asleep. You know that." Emily swallowed hard, feeling the heat rise to her face, a mix of fear and disbelief. "I know," she said, "but it called my name." The sound had been soft, patient, deliberate, almost human, but not quite. Outside, Daniel's truck had passed their home, moving slowly along the curve of the road where the forest grew thick. He thought of the elder's warning. It doesn't wear faces, it wears relationships. He could not shake the feeling that something in those trees knew him, was learning him. When he reached a clearing, the headlights caught something small, a shadow on the snow, moving just beyond the reach of the light. He froze. The figure didn't move like a human, but its outline was unmistakably familiar. A child's size, a girl's stance. His pulse quickened. Back at the Carters, Emily and Mark checked the cameras installed near the basement the previous month after unexplained noises had escalated. The footage was ordinary: empty rooms, the hum of the furnace, the faint shifting of shadows. And yet, there was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, like the basement floorboards rising slightly where no one had stepped. Lily stirred in her sleep, murmuring, and Emily's stomach twisted with dread. In town, another resident, a delivery clerk at the diner, checked her phone. She had received a voicemail. The caller ID was her own number. With trembling hands, she pressed play. The line was silent at first, then a whisper came, careful and familiar, calling her name over and over. The hair on her arm stood straight, and she dropped the phone, staring at it as if it might bite. Daniel parked on a side road, headlights off, listening. The figure from the snowbank had vanished, but the feeling of observation remained. Every step of the tires across ice and snow sounded loud in the quiet, and he realized that wherever he looked, the dark seemed to have depth, as though something waited just beyond sight. At the Carters, Mark tried to reassure Emily. "It's probably nothing," he said again, more firmly. He wanted to believe it, to ground himself in reason, yet his own unease betrayed him. Emily opened the basement door slowly, light from the overhead bulb illuminating the concrete stairs. Nothing. Nothing visible. Only the familiar scent of the old house, damp and cold, and the whisper of the wind through the floorboards. And yet, they both knew something had been there. The scratching, the patient voice, the sensation of being watched. It was impossible to ignore. Outside, the storm continued, snow piling up on empty roads. Daniel continued his rounds, gripping the wheel, glancing at the forest, feeling it follow him. The town was quiet, deceptively so, and yet small events were stacking into a pattern too strange to dismiss. Shadows that moved unnaturally, voices that should not exist, animals that reacted to invisible presences, phones that called themselves, and snowbanks that seemed to hide figures just beyond human recognition. Emily hugged Lily's quilt, forcing herself to calm, while Mark stayed by the basement, eyes fixed on the door, as if staring might keep whatever was beneath it from emerging. Something small, patient, and familiar had begun to test them. The night was only beginning. The night after the first strange events, the town felt smaller. Snow fell silently, thick and heavy, covering footprints almost as soon as they were made. Yet every path felt watched. Emily lay awake, listening to the soft groan of the old house and the occasional whisper of wind against the windows, feeling a weight pressing against the walls. Mark slept beside her, chest rising and falling steadily, unaware of the tension that tightened Emily's muscles as she glanced toward the basement door. Lily stirred in her room, in her sleep, and Emily held the blanket tight, listening for anything unusual, any sound that didn't belong. Outside, Daniel Reyes drove the winding forest road, headlights cutting through the falling snow. The delivery route had become less predictable in recent nights. He had started noticing figures in the tree line, sometimes small, childlike, sometimes tall, unmoving, always just beyond the light. Tonight, he had slowed the truck when a figure appeared on the roadside. Its shape was human, but something about it was wrong. The posture was too rigid, the angles of the limbs slightly unnatural. He honked the horn, and the figure blinked once before vanishing, leaving the snow unbroken as if it had never been there. In town, the reports began to come in. A woman called the local diner, frantic, claiming she had seen her husband standing at the edge of the forest, waving to her, beckoning her to follow. She ran toward him, calling his name, but when she reached the trees, the figure was gone. The footprint she had followed began as human, then shifted, elongated, paw-like, a strange combination of man and animal. Back at the Carters' home, Emily had checked the basement again after hearing small noises that night, subtle taps like fingernails against concrete. Mark tried to reassure her, but the unease in his voice betrayed him. Lily, asleep in her room, began muttering again, murmuring words Emily couldn't fully understand. Something was learning the sounds, the names, the familiar voices, the trust they had in one another. Daniel's route brought him past the Carters' driveway once more. He slowed as the wind shifted, carrying faint sounds across the snow. A whisper reached him, carried through the cab's radio static. "Daniel?" The voice was patient, deliberate, and undeniably real. Goosebumps rose along his arms as he gripped the steering wheel. For the first time, he understood the elder's warning fully. It doesn't wear faces, it wears relationships. In another part of town, a neighbor reported a voicemail from her own number. She hesitated before playing it, fingers shaking, but when the line came to life, a familiar voice whispered her name over and over, soft and deliberate. She dropped the phone, heart racing, staring at it as if it could attack her. The sense of being observed settled over everyone, subtle at first, then growing like an unshakable shadow. At the Carters' house, Emily began noticing minor but unnerving changes. Objects shifted slightly when she wasn't looking. Shadows lingered just past the corners of her vision. Lily sometimes looked toward the walls and spoke to someone invisible, calling for a friend she did not have. Mark noticed the small movements too, the basement door's handle slightly warmer than it should be, faint scratches along the floorboards, a sudden chill that passed through the room even with the furnace running. One evening, Emily went to check the cameras she had installed months before, just to monitor the basement after the first unexplained noises. Reviewing the footage, she saw what appeared to be nothing at first. Empty rooms, the faint hum of the furnace, the shadows shifting with the lights. But when she slowed the playback, subtle movements became visible. Floorboards lifted slightly, shadows that should have disappeared lingered, and for a fraction of a second, she saw a small figure standing at the bottom of the basement stairs, indistinct, its features impossible to resolve. Her heart raced. She pressed pause, rewinding, and the figure vanished. The house felt impossibly quiet after that, though Emily knew the presence was still there, patient, learning, waiting. Daniel had parked on a side road after seeing a small figure moving between the snow-covered trees. The shape paused to look at him, tilting its head unnaturally, and he realized something horrifying. It was copying movements, testing reactions, learning how to behave like a human. He tried to drive on, but the feeling of being followed remained. A shadow crossed the truck's headlights again, leaving no footprint, no trace of passage. He understood instinctively that whatever it was feeding on recognition, on observation, on the familiarity of being seen. That same night, the Carters' house seemed alive with subtle disturbances. The air in Lily's room felt heavy, as if someone, or something, stood just beyond perception. Emily held her daughter's hand for a long moment, noting the way her fingers felt impossibly small, impossibly human, and yet strange under the skin. Mark tried to laugh it off, making a casual remark about creaking pipes, but his voice faltered halfway through. Something had begun testing them, probing the edges of their understanding, learning the sounds they trusted, the names they answered to. The town around them, quiet and snowbound, held similar tensions. Lights flickered in distant houses, dogs whimpered, ears pricked at nothing visible. People reported fleeting glimpses of loved ones in impossible places, at doors, along the roads, in forests that had long been abandoned. Footsteps appeared in the snow where no one had walked, beginning human and ending as something else entirely. Daniel drove on, aware that whatever followed him was not human. He could feel it in the unnatural angles of its movements, the patience in the way it observed from the darkness, the way the forest seemed to bend around it. At the Carters' house, Emily whispered to Lily, "It's nothing, just your imagination," though she did not fully believe it herself. Mark leaned against the doorframe, frowning, listening. The basement door sat silently, but the memory of the voice calling Emily's name earlier that week lingered like a warning. Something had begun, something patient and deliberate, testing boundaries, learning names and faces. The night deepened, long and still, and though snow drifted over the town like a blanket, covering every sound, every footprint, the feeling of being watched grew. Shadows stretched unnaturally, footsteps appeared where none had been taken, and the forest at the edge of town waited. It was learning, and the town did not yet understand what it was capable of. The first small signs had emerged, subtle, almost dismissible, but undeniable to those who were paying attention. Emily and Mark, Daniel, and others in town could feel it, could hear it, could see its traces in the snow, in the shadows, in voices they should not recognize. Something was here, something patient, something that knew their names. And it was only beginning. The nights had begun stretching impossibly long, the pale January sun barely rising above the horizon before slipping behind the mountains, leaving the town blanketed in a gray twilight that seemed to thicken with each passing hour. Emily Carter could feel it in the walls of her home, in the faint chill that persisted even when the furnace hummed at full strength. The strange occurrences had grown bolder. No longer subtle whispers or distant scratches, the presence was testing boundaries directly. One evening, Emily sat in the living room with Lily, reading a story aloud to distract from the unease that had settled like a weight on her chest. Mark was in the kitchen, clearing dishes, but every clink of metal against ceramic seemed amplified, echoing through the quiet house like a drumbeat. Then, faintly at first, they heard it. The soft, deliberate sound of crying. It was high-pitched, childlike, echoing faintly through the living room walls. Lily froze mid-page, her small hands gripping the book tightly. "Mom?" she whispered. Emily froze, recognizing the tone instantly. It wasn't Lily crying. The child sat in her lap, perfectly still, eyes wide, but the voice came from somewhere else, beneath the house, outside, everywhere at once. Mark's brow furrowed. "It's the wind," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Emily shook her head, pressing a hand to Lily's shoulder. "No, that's not the wind." The cries continued, shifting subtly, mimicking the timbre of children's voices from the neighborhood, some faintly familiar, some entirely unknown. Outside, Daniel Reyes drove his nightly route, headlights cutting through the thick snowfall along the forest edge. A figure appeared again, crouched near the road, small and indistinct. As he slowed, the figure lifted its head. Daniel's stomach dropped. Its face was human, vaguely, but wrong, unfinished, asymmetrical, lacking the subtle details that made someone recognizable. The snow around it remained untouched. He blinked, and it disappeared into the darkness without a sound. Back at the Carters, Emily felt a new horror creeping into her chest. Something tapped gently at the basement door, soft, irregular knocks, deliberate pauses. The sound had rhythm, intelligence. Mark approached cautiously, heart pounding. He leaned in to listen, then pulled back. It knows we're here," he said, voice low. Emily could only nod, the fear spreading like ice through her limbs. That night, Daniel encountered a neighbor's dog again, one that had always been calm, obedient, and fearless. The dog froze at the edge of the snow, ears pricked, hackles raised. Then it barked and lunged at nothing visible, snapping and biting into the empty air. Its body shook with terror, yelping as it stumbled backward, before retreating to the warmth of its owner's arms. Daniel slowed the truck, watching the scene unfold through the snow-covered windshield, heart racing. The animal's fear was tangible, palpable, and human in its intensity. Across town, small disturbances had escalated into unnerving interactions. Lights flickered inside homes where no one should have been. Phones rang without calls. A woman opening her door saw her husband standing in the yard, beckoning her to follow, only for him to vanish into the snow as she approached. Footprints began human, then shifted, elongated, uneven, paw-like, impossible. Emily's unease deepened as the presence seemed to play with her perception. She saw shadows move in corners when no one was there. Objects shifted when she looked away. Lily spoke softly to something she insisted was a friend in the hallway, but when Emily turned, the space was empty. Mark began sleeping lightly, waking at odd hours to strange noises, a whisper outside the bedroom door, a soft tap on the window, the scratching of claws against walls. They no longer questioned their own senses. They only questioned what to do. Emily kept a notebook of observations, writing down each sound, each anomaly, each whisper of a voice not belonging to anyone alive. The entries became more frantic with every passing day. Daniel drove past the forest again, headlights cutting through the snow and mist. A figure appeared near the tree line, staggering as though injured. It called out a name. His name. Daniel froze. The posture, the voice, the presence. It mimicked someone he knew, but in ways subtly wrong. The figure staggered forward, extending a hand as if asking for help, and Daniel's pulse hammered. He recognized the tactic. It was learning not just appearances, but human instincts, the way people responded to need and vulnerability. Back in the Carter home, the basement door creaked again. Emily and Mark held their breath. Lily whimpered, tugging at her mother's sleeve. The knocks grew louder, deliberate, testing, probing. Emily gripped a flashlight and approached slowly, hand hovering over the handle. She could feel a presence pressing from the other side, patient and deliberate, waiting for recognition. She hesitated. Mark stood behind her, shaking his head slightly. "Don't," he whispered. But Emily's hand moved anyway, brushing the cold metal. Nothing. Only the faintest echo of movement beneath the floor. Across the town, similar scenes unfolded. People reported crying outside their doors. Children, sometimes adults. Voices mimicking loved ones, soft and desperate. Shadows pressed against walls, only to vanish when looked at directly. Daniel saw another figure in the forest, crouched and motionless, imitating the posture of a child he had noticed earlier. It didn't move like a human, yet it was learning, observing, testing reactions, waiting for someone to act on instinct. By the end of the night, the town felt smaller, suffocating, as though the snow itself pressed down, amplifying the sense of observation. Emily, Mark, and Lily sat together in the living room, hearts pounding, knowing the world outside the walls was no longer safe in ordinary ways. Daniel parked his truck and listened to the empty forest, the wind carrying soft whispers of names he recognized, voices he could not locate. The presence was no longer subtle. It had begun to experiment, to manipulate, to draw attention, and everyone who noticed could feel its intelligence, patient and deliberate, at work. In the Carters' home, the basement door remained closed, but the knowledge that something waited beneath it, that something could imitate, manipulate, and prey on their trust, hung heavier than any snowdrift outside. The Skinwalker was learning, and the town did not yet know how easily it could deceive. The snow fell heavier now, the streets of the small town buried under thick drifts, the wind howling through the pines as though carrying voices from elsewhere. At the Carter house, Emily could no longer sleep. She moved from room to room, checking the locks, the windows, the basement door, her chest tight with the knowledge that something had learned her family, learned the rhythms of her home. Lily slept fitfully, murmuring words Emily did not recognize. Mark paced the living room, jaw tight, eyes darting toward the walls and windows, every sound amplified by the oppressive quiet. It had begun in subtle ways, the whispers, the shadows, the strange movements, but now the presence was bolder. It tested them directly, mimicking not just voices, but gestures, expressions, the familiarity of the people they trusted most. One evening, the basement door creaked, slow and deliberate, as if being pushed from the other side. Emily's hand trembled over the handle. "Mark," she whispered. He stepped forward, shaking his head. "Don't," he said firmly, but his voice faltered under the weight of the tension. Outside, Daniel Reyes drove along the forest road again. The truck's headlights illuminated small figures in the distance, human-shaped, moving unnaturally, too slowly, too carefully. One of them raised a hand in greeting, mimicking a wave Daniel had given a neighbor earlier. Another tilted its head like a child he had seen walking to school. It was copying, learning, testing, calculating. He slowed, heart hammering, realizing the truth he had feared. The presence wasn't limited to the Carters. It was spreading, finding people who had been observed, imitating them to draw others out, to manipulate. Across town, residents began reporting strange incidents. Families saw their loved ones at their doors, smiling, beckoning, voices soft and insistent. One woman followed a figure she believed to be her husband into the trees, only to find footprints that began human and ended in the elongated, paw-like impressions of something not quite animal. Dogs attacked invisible presences, yelping in fear, some refusing to return to the safety of their homes. Phones rang from numbers that didn't exist. Voices called from empty rooms. The pattern was clear, terrifying in its simplicity. The Skinwalker could not create, only imitate. It used what it had seen, what it had heard, what it had learned. It preyed on trust, on recognition, on love. At the Carter house, Emily kept a notebook, documenting each anomaly. The whispers, the shadows, the strange scratches along the walls, the fleeting figures glimpsed out of the corner of her eye. Mark paced the living room, restless, aware that the basement was no longer just a space. It was a threshold, a point of testing. Lily's small voice sometimes echoed from it, though she remained upstairs, asleep. Something was learning the family, the rhythms of the home, and it was patient, deliberate, and dangerous. One night, multiple figures appeared at once in the town. At first, they seemed like neighbors, friends, family members, figures familiar enough to be trusted. They stood in driveways, at windows, calling names softly, coaxing people into following them. The sheriff issued warnings. No one was to open doors at night, no one to acknowledge figures outside, no one to answer voices. But the presence learned quickly. It discovered the subtle ways people could be encouraged to let it in. An accidental glance, a moment of doubt, a whisper of curiosity. Emily and Mark fortified the house as best they could. Locks, chains, lights on timers, everything they could think of. Still, the knocks came. The cries came. The soft, familiar calls from outside, coaxing Lily's name, Emily's name, Mark's name. Daniel watched from the forest road as the figures grew bolder, moving through snow and shadow, pausing at windows and doors. One figure staggered as if injured, limping along the snow, crying softly. It called for help in a voice that mimicked a neighbor. Daniel's stomach churned. It was bait, manipulation, a test of human instinct. Some townspeople fell for it. Doors opened, homes were invaded. Screams echoed faintly through the wind, muffled by snow, carrying the unmistakable sound of panic, fear, and the unnatural imitations of voices that should have been safe. Emily's fear became a living thing, She could feel the presence pressing against the walls, lurking at the edges of vision, manipulating the familiar into something horrifying. Mark kept Lily close, refusing to leave the interior of the house. Outside, shadows moved with purpose. Daniel parked the truck and watched figures in the forest, multiple now, moving in patterns that were not natural, copying movements and sounds of people from his town, from his roots. He could see the subtle errors, the faces slightly off, the voices slightly wrong, but the effect on those who encountered them was devastating. Families were tricked. Neighbors vanished after following figures they trusted. Doors opened for what should not be allowed entry. Emily understood, finally, the depth of the danger. The presence could not enter uninvited, but it had learned how to be welcomed, how to coax, how to manipulate instincts and trust. It used what people loved most, their children, their spouses, their friends, to draw them out. Daniel realized that the patterns were consistent. It was not a singular creature, not a beast lurking in the woods. It was a method, a strategy, an intelligence. It learned by observation, by recognition, and it preyed on the emotional bonds that humans relied on. The snow continued to fall, muffling footsteps, erasing evidence. But the pattern was growing, spreading. Emily watched Lily sleep, trembling, while Mark held the doors shut. Outside, distant screams echoed faintly, carried by the wind, mixing with whispers of familiar voices. Daniel drove past a clearing, seeing figures moving in ways that defied human understanding, copies of people he knew, but subtly wrong. The town was no longer safe. The presence had learned how to manipulate, how to infiltrate, how to be welcomed. The horror was no longer subtle. It had grown into a tangible, pervasive threat, and everyone who had witnessed it understood that they were already at its mercy. The night seemed endless, the darkness pressing against the town, snow piling over roads and footprints alike. Emily and Mark sat together, hands clutching each other, and Lily, hearts racing, aware that the pattern had grown stronger, more intelligent, more patient. Daniel parked on a side road, watching the forest, realizing that what he had been warned about, what he had glimpsed, was not a trick of perception, nor a single entity. It was the intelligence of mimicry, patience, and observation, and it had begun to claim the town, one household, one name at a time. The horror of recognition, the feeling that something familiar could turn dangerous, was complete. The Skinwalker had arrived, and the town had no way to fight it. The snow continued to fall in thick, muffling sheets, blanketing the town in gray and white, and the night had become a void of silence, broken only by the occasional creak of ice-laden branches or the distant howl of a wind-tortured animal. Emily Carter sat cross-legged on the living room floor, Lily asleep beside her, small chest rising and falling in even breaths, a blanket pulled tightly around her. Mark leaned against the doorframe, exhaustion etched into every line of his face, eyes flicking to the basement door as though its mere presence might spring into life at any moment. Every shadow in the room felt deliberate, almost conscious, as though the house itself had become aware of them, waiting, patient, and calculating. Outside, Daniel Reyes idled in his delivery truck on a deserted stretch of forest road. Headlights cut feeble paths through the swirling snow, revealing hints of shapes that shifted in the periphery, figures that moved with the fluidity of shadows, copying gestures, pauses, and postures he recognized from houses he had passed countless times over his routes. There was familiarity in their forms, but familiarity twisted, something almost right, almost comforting, but fundamentally wrong. Faces looked human, yet unfinished. Eyes were too still or too wide. Movements were jerky, as if learning, testing. Daniel's chest tightened as he recalled the elder's words from a bitterly cold afternoon months ago. It doesn't wear faces, it wears relationships. He finally understood. The Skinwalker was not a singular creature, nor a wolf, nor a man. It was not even a beast in the traditional sense. It was a pattern, a form of intelligence distilled into mimicry, observing, memorizing, and learning from every person it encountered, replicating the bonds they relied on to navigate the world. Emily felt the realization like ice crawling through her veins. Every whisper in the dark, Every step outside the window, every voice that called her name or Lily's, every sound that seemed to come from the familiar had been a test, an invitation. The Skinwalker could not simply enter uninvited. It required acknowledgment, a glance, a spoken name, a response. All of these were doors it could exploit. Once welcomed, even unwittingly, it could manipulate, copy, and terrify with impunity. Mark's voice trembled when Emily explained her notes, her observations. "It's learning us," he said, disbelief coloring his tone. "It's learning everything we know, everything we love. And it waits." The snowstorm outside seemed to thicken, as if responding to his words. Shadows coalesced at the edge of Daniel's headlights. Figures multiplied, stepping into the swirling whiteness, testing, observing, pausing, every gesture intentional. Children he had seen, neighbors, acquaintances, faces familiar yet grotesquely altered. They did not speak, yet their presence conveyed communication. Every subtle movement, every tilt of the head, every calculated pause was designed to elicit recognition, to gain consent. Emily's throat tightened as she watched Lily sleep, holding her hand, realizing that the smallest misstep, a whispered name, a glance, even an instinctual gesture, could open a door the Skinwalker could exploit. She had fed it unknowingly. Every time she had answered a voice in the dark, every time she had called for someone in the forest. Daniel felt the same pressure, seeing the shadows pause, mimic, tilt heads as though testing his own recognition. It was patient, unhurried, understanding that observation and acknowledgement were the keys to entry. Across the snow-covered town, houses stood like tombstones, huddled beneath drifts of snow, silent but permeated by the invisible presence. Emily whispered Lily's name softly, testing herself, feeling the immense risk in even this innocent act. Mark tightened his grip on her shoulder. The shadow of recognition hung over every step, every breath. It was impossible to act naturally without potentially granting the pattern access. Months of subtle observation had led to this understanding. The Skinwalker was not bound by morality, by time, or by human limitation. Its only rules were the subtle mechanics of recognition, of trust, of human connection. Each acknowledgement, each spoken name, was a thread it could pull to unravel safety. Emily and Mark had fortified their home as best they could. Extra locks, lights on timers, constant vigilance. Yet the knowledge that the presence could adapt, learn, and exploit recognition made every breath, every movement a calculated risk. Even inside their own home, they were prisoners. Daniel watched from his truck, realizing he could not outrun it. The pattern was not tied to roads, boundaries, or walls. It moved through observation, learning, waiting for a single key: recognition. Outside, the snowstorm raged. Shadows moved in and out of visibility, faces familiar yet impossible, voices soft and coaxing. They mimicked, they waited, they tested the bonds people relied on for comfort and safety. And then it settled fully in Emily's chest. It knew them all. Mark, Lily, Daniel, her own name. Each had given it fragments, consciously or not. Names gave it permission. Recognition gave it entry. Belief gave it strength. Across the town, figures lurked in peripheral vision, watching from impossible angles, observing, calculating. The Skinwalker was no longer a threat lurking outside. It had become a presence woven into perception, a pattern that existed wherever names were spoken, wherever trust was given. Emily clutched Lily close, Mark leaning rigid against the wall, aware that even the smallest misstep could be fatal. Daniel, watching from the tree line, understood there was no simple escape. The pattern had learned them, memorized them, studied them. It was patient, deliberate, unstoppable in its subtlety. Recognition was permission. Names were keys. And now, it held all of them. It waited. And outside, the night whispered their names back to them, patient, deliberate, and terrifyingly alive. The wind outside the Carter house had grown sharper. carrying the gnawing chill of January deep into the bones. Snow hammered against windows like tiny fists, and the forest beyond the tree line was a shifting white void, hiding movement too deliberate to be wind. Inside, Emily felt the weight of the night pressing down, Lily's small body curled against her side, and Mark standing near the door, eyes scanning every shadow, every sound. Silence was no longer a relief. It was a signal, a pause in which something waited. Daniel Reyes drove slowly along the forest road, headlights barely penetrating the storm. Shapes moved at the edge of the beams, human forms, yet wrong. Limbs elongated or stiff, faces too smooth, smiles that did not reach eyes. They mirrored people he knew, neighbors, friends, children he had delivered to countless times, yet each was subtly twisted. He realized with cold certainty, the Skinwalker had multiplied, learning faster than any single human could anticipate. Every route he had taken, every casual glance or wave had been recorded. Every name he had spoken over the years was a key now in the pattern's invisible lock. Back in the Carter house, Emily's phone vibrated. A voicemail notification appeared, her own number calling her. Her hands shook as she pressed play. The voice was Lily's, but Lily was asleep beside her. The voice whispered, faintly at first, then louder. "Mom, please, come outside." She froze. Mark's hand found hers. "Don't go," he hissed. "It's not her." But the pull, the unnatural familiarity of the voice, was almost magnetic. The pattern knew how to make the familiar irresistible. A sudden noise from the basement, a scraping, dragging sound, made Lily stir. Emily's heart lurched. She could hear the faintest echo of her own name, drawn out, coaxing, curling around the edges of fear. The lights flickered. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch and twist, and for a fraction of a second, she thought she saw the doorway bend, like the house itself was breathing in sync with the presence outside. Daniel had pulled his truck to the side, snow already covering the tracks he had made. Figures emerged from the tree line, multiple now, moving in sync yet independently. They mimicked movements he had made months ago, pausing at mailboxes, tilting heads, stepping lightly over snowdrifts. Their faces were human enough to be recognizable, familiar enough to evoke instinctive trust, yet wrong, unfinished, terrifyingly still. One figure raised its hand, and Daniel's stomach nodded. He knew that gesture. It was a wave he had returned months ago, a casual acknowledgment. Recognition, he realized with horror, had been the invitation. Inside the house, Emily and Mark worked frantically, bolting doors, moving furniture to block access points, leaving lights on timers, checking windows repeatedly. Yet every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through cracks was amplified. Lily's small voice murmured in her sleep, and Emily's heart jumped every time it seemed to echo or repeat. The line between reality and imitation blurred. The Skinwalker did not need to attack physically. It manipulated the mind, the senses, the relationships that anchored people. Suddenly, from outside the living room window, Mark spotted it. A figure standing on the snowbank beyond the yard. Its shape was human, but the posture was slightly off, head tilted too far, limbs too long. It did not move in the natural rhythm of a human body. It paused and then stepped again, as though learning, testing. And it called, in a voice Emily could not ignore, "Mark? It's me?" Mark swallowed hard, mouth dry, and the tension in the room thickened. The presence had adapted. It had learned what would make him respond, what would weaken their defenses. Daniel watched similar figures moving in the snow. They did not approach openly, but lingered on the edges of vision, learning. He knew now that running would not save him. Every glance he made, every acknowledgement, every instinctive human reaction fed the pattern. The Skinwalker's intelligence was not brute force. It was subtle, patient, and methodical. Recognition was permission. Names were keys. Inside, Emily realized the unthinkable. They could not hide indefinitely. The Skinwalker could copy their loved ones, mimic voices, gestures, even expressions. It could appear injured, coax sympathy, cry like a child, call like Lily, walk like Mark, even mimic Daniel's own movements. It was everywhere they trusted, Everywhere they felt safe. And it had been learning for months, storing every detail, every nuance of human behavior. The wind shifted suddenly, rattling the windows. A scraping sound returned from the basement. Emily and Mark exchanged a glance, fear and understanding passing between them. They were trapped, not by walls or snow, but by the bonds they relied on. They could not ignore the familiar. To do so was unnatural. To respond was dangerous. Every moment became a test, every sound a potential doorway. Hours passed, though time felt meaningless. The snowstorm raged outside, lights flickered inside. Emily whispered Lily's name softly, testing herself, testing the boundaries, understanding the danger of even innocent utterances. Mark gripped her hand tightly. Daniel saw a figure approach his truck again, this one more precise, more deliberate than the last. It mimicked not just his posture, but his hesitation, his breath fogging in the cold. Recognition had given it entry, and now it was refining its methods. And then Emily heard it again, faint but undeniable, a voice coming from the living room shadows. "Mom? I'm here?" Lily slept beside her. The weight of understanding crushed her chest. The pattern had learned them completely. The Skinwalker was not a beast in the woods. It was a presence woven into human perception, a reflection of trust, a mirror of recognition, patient, adaptable, and now intimately familiar with everything they held dear. Emily's mind raced. If names were keys, if recognition allowed entry, then every person they had ever called or acknowledged, every glance, every wave, every instinctive gesture, could become a doorway. The Skinwalker's reach was infinite, boundless wherever recognition existed. Their home was fortified, their vigilance constant, but the knowledge gnawed at them. No lock, no barricade, no precaution would ever fully protect them. The presence only needed acknowledgement, a single thread of trust, and it would slip inside, subtle, patient, unstoppable. The wind outside howled. Snowflakes whipped against the windows in a frenzy. Shadows moved across the yard, beyond the trees, across the roads, across the town. Recognition, observation, names, bonds, these were its instruments. Emily pulled Lily close, Mark bracing by her side, Daniel gripping the steering wheel in the forest, all aware of the same unyielding truth. They could not outrun it. They could not ignore it without risking their humanity. The Skinwalker had learned their names. It had studied them. It had adapted. And now it waited. The night stretched on, unbroken and unrelenting, snowflakes driving against windows like tiny knives, each gust carrying a silence so thick it pressed against the eardrums. Emily Carter held Lily tightly, feeling her daughter's slow, steady breathing, the only reassurance against the invisible terror that had been learning them for months. Mark leaned nearby, watching the basement door as if sheer willpower could keep the presence at bay. They had barricaded every entrance, every window, bolted every lock, and yet the feeling of being watched never left. It was not a presence that struck with claws or fangs. It struck with recognition, patience, and the uncanny mimicry of familiarity. Daniel Reyes drove slowly along the forest road, headlights cutting through the storm, trying to make sense of the shadows that mirrored him, that copied gestures and postures he had made months ago, years even. Every step he took, every glance he had made, was cataloged, stored, and refined. He understood now. It did not simply want to terrify. It wanted acknowledgement, trust. And every name it could gather became another key to access more than just a space. It gained access to fear, hesitation, instinct. Each recognition fed it, taught it, expanded it. Inside the Carter home, Emily whispered Lily's name once more, testing herself, and felt the immediate pull of the pattern. It was learning still, adjusting, always observing. Mark's voice was low, clipped, almost trembling. "We can't stop it," he said. "Not here, not in the town. We have to leave, all of us. Every second we stay is a chance we give it." They packed quickly, Lily clutched between them, boots crunching on the frozen snow outside as they slipped into the night. The streets were empty, the town hushed under the storm, but shadows lingered, moving in the peripheral, testing, waiting. Daniel caught sight of a figure in the distance, pale, unfinished, mirroring a gesture he had made that morning, and he instinctively looked away. Even in retreat, they were being cataloged, studied. Driving down the highway, headlights barely piercing the whiteout, Daniel realized there was no safe distance. The Skinwalker followed not in speed, but in understanding. Every town, every place they had lived or passed through, every relationship acknowledged was a thread it could manipulate. The winter air bit at Emily's face, but it was nothing compared to the chill of comprehension. The pattern did not need doors to enter a home if it had the threads of recognition. And every step they had taken, every human connection they had made, had left doors open. Hours passed. They reached the outskirts of the state, towns unfamiliar, streets lined with strangers. Emily glanced at Lily sleeping, small and peaceful, but even in her dreams, the voice whispered faintly, coaxing, bending reality just enough to make her doubt. Mark drove with hands tight on the wheel, silent except for the occasional whisper to Emily. Daniel trailed behind in his truck, noticing that even the shadows seemed to move differently now, as if the pattern had adapted to new territory, testing its reach. They found a motel, one of the few still open in the bitter cold, and checked in, careful to avoid eye contact with anyone lingering outside. Emily set Lily on the bed and looked out the window at the darkened streets, heart hammering, realizing the truth that had been evident for months. The Skinwalker was not bound to one place, to one town. It was everywhere recognition existed. It followed threads of connection, bonds of trust, and every human who responded, even instinctively, fed it. That night, Emily lay beside Lily, staring at the ceiling, listening. The wind rattled the window panes, and for a moment, she swore she heard a small voice calling softly from outside. "Mom? Emily?" Her pulse jumped. Lily stirred. Mark's hand found hers, gripping tightly. "It's not her," he whispered. But she could feel the certainty in her chest. The pattern had adapted. It could learn anywhere, and now it knew their names. It knew recognition. It knew belief, and those were all it needed. Daniel parked his truck outside another town, lights dimmed, snow covering tire tracks, and stared into the forest just beyond the highway. Movement flickered, imperceptible at first, then more deliberate. Shapes mimicked him from the shadows, each iteration a little closer to exact, each gesture a thread pulling at the edges of reality. He understood fully now. There was no outrunning it. The Skinwalker was not a creature confined by geography. It existed wherever acknowledgment occurred, wherever humans allowed trust or recognition to be given. Across the country, in every town, in every home where names were spoken, relationships observed, small gestures made, the pattern spread. It learned silently, patiently, endlessly. Emily whispered Lily's name once more, softly, almost unconsciously, and felt the weight of inevitability settle in her chest. Every name they had ever spoken, every familiar face, every recognition, it had been feeding the intelligence, strengthening the pattern. She realized the inescapable truth. The Skinwalker was now a part of their lives, their perceptions, their reality. It was patient. It was everywhere, and it was waiting. And then, months later, far from Michigan, in a city Emily had never thought to flee to, she sat in her apartment, Lily beside her, Mark reading nearby. The city hummed with distant traffic, the normal sounds of life outside. And then, faint but unmistakable, a voice called from the darkness outside the window. "Mom? Emily?" Emily froze, her hand clutching Lily's, realizing that the voice had crossed borders, boundaries, and miles. But when she looked outside, the street was empty. The voice belonged to no one. And yet, it was hers. Recognition had given it access. Names were keys, and the pattern had found them again. The Skinwalker was not a place. It was everywhere they had ever been, everywhere recognition existed, patient, silent, watching, waiting for the smallest acknowledgment to strike. Emily exhaled slowly, realizing that even here, even now, there was no final escape. She had survived the night, survived the snow, survived the town, but the Skinwalker, the pattern, the mimic, had learned them fully, and it would follow, always.